Shields up! Council patrol on approach! The shout cracked across the control deck, pulling every set of eyes toward the laser plasma display mounted above the bulkhead. Blue streaks pulsed across the grid, each line marking a blockade frigate sliding into position around Earth's orbital belt. The operators' hands hovered over consoles, their faces washed in the glow of warning icons that pulsed like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Commander Darren Voss leaned forward, his knuckles pressed white against the railing, as if bracing himself against the pressure of the entire world folding in on him. The Council had not sent a warning convoy this time. They came in tight formation, engines flaring like angry scars across the darkness, a dozen spearheads forming a choke line over the jump lanes. Their interceptors drifted in layers, hunting anything that tried to run. The station shuddered when the Council cut communications with the colonies and broadcast their ultimatum instead. Compliance windows scrolling in harsh red fonts, layered with penalty scales that climbed from seizure to destruction. The message was clinical in delivery but cruel in effect. Every orbiting trader, every shuttle crew, every colonist on outposts beyond Mars now saw Earth sealed in a prison of warships. "Cut the feeds," Voss ordered. His voice was controlled, but the sinews along his jaw twitched. He didn't want the crew watching the Council's display of power any longer than necessary. He gestured to the civil liaison beside him. "Initiate ration alerts district-wide. Tell the cities the blockade is permanent, not a drill." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the public will panic." "They already are," Voss snapped. "Better they panic with truth than collapse with lies. Do it." Beyond the reinforced windows, the trade lanes dimmed. Where once traffic had streamed, supply barges, agricultural carriers, ferries see, huddling colonists. There was only emptiness. A silence crept into the crew's breathing. Even the sensor clicks sounded sharper, each echo reminding them that nothing moved now without Council approval. Earth's orbital trade had been reduced to zero in a single sweep of bureaucracy enforced by steel. Hours later, Voss descended from the command deck into the civilian quarters of the station. The air reeked of recycled sweat, damp clothes, and something sour from uncollected food waste. Families pressed against corridors, waiting for news, their whispers darting like frightened insects. Children clutched ration tokens, eyes wide at the sight of soldiers in armored jackets. Voss forced himself to walk slowly, to meet their gazes one by one. Authority meant nothing if it didn't show its face when fear spread fastest. In the capital city below, riots had already broken through the ration distribution centers. Voss received reports of mobs storming grain silos, guards overwhelmed, streets littered with broken crates. By nightfall, bodies lay on the pavement, some trampled, some struck down when anger boiled into violence. Among them was his younger brother, Kalen. Voss read the report twice, the letters carving into him like blades. Kalen had been working as a relief coordinator, trying to calm a crowd that refused to believe the shipments had been cut off. A surge, a crush, and he was gone. Voss sat alone in his quarters, boots still dusty from the station floor, the data pad lying silent in his lap. He could hear the whir of ventilation above and the muffled cough of an engineer in the corridor. The everyday noises felt louder, crueler, as if the world insisted on moving while his blood froze. He closed his eyes and saw Kalen's grin, the younger man who used to smuggle food during academy nights, who once told him that war was for those without imagination. Now imagination would not bring him back. The next morning, Voss gathered his senior staff in the briefing dome. The curved glass ceiling reflected the scarred horizon of Earth, a blue world ringed by hostile steel. Officers sat in rows, eyes fixed on him, waiting for direction that could make sense of the impossible. "The Council wants us to fracture," Voss said, voice steady though his throat burned. "They believe hunger will do their work. We won't give them the satisfaction. From this day, every orbital asset disperses into separate vectors, no central hub. If one is taken, the rest survive. Civil defense drills begin immediately in all districts. Rationing protocols escalate. The population must learn to endure scarcity. We will not fall apart. An officer in the logistics chair cleared his throat. Sir, without trade, within 3 months... I know the charts, Voss cut in, his tone sharp but not cruel. 3 months is enough to adapt if we act now. Underground agriculture, asteroid conversion, stockpiles hidden in belt stations. Every engineer becomes a survivalist. Every worker builds for endurance. This is no longer commerce. This is containment, and containment can be broken only if we hold together. Silence filled the dome. They all knew the odds. They all knew the blockade was meant to crush not with weapons, but with time. Voss let them feel that weight before adding, softer. We lost people already. Some of us lost family. I won't let those deaths be the first in a long line that ends with our flag burned out of the stars. If they mean to cage us, then we learn to live inside a cage until the moment we decide how to shatter it. Orders went out. Civil defense sirens wailed through cities, not as warnings of bombardment, but as reminders to collect rations, to store water, to prepare basements for shelter. Families stacked supplies in silence. Teachers told students why the skies above were guarded by warships that did not belong to them. In the shipyards, workers stripped old freighters of ornament, fitting them with modular armor and coated shields. Life turned from ordinary routine into survival choreography. Voss stood at the viewport one last time that evening. The blockade gleamed overhead, each ship a dagger angled toward his world. Yet in the darkness between their patrol arcs, he imagined the invisible networks already forming, hidden factories, secret convoys, men and women who would not break. He pressed his palm against the glass, not as a salute, but as a vow. The ring had closed, but inside it, humanity still breathed, and breathing meant they could fight. Dig deeper. If they catch one spark from this site, every man here dies. Soren Dask's barked command bounced against the cavern walls, rolling over the miners who had stopped to catch their breath. The ground shook faintly from the drills below, a shudder that made dust sift down in a powdery veil over helmets and shoulders. The air was thick with grit, every inhale carrying the taste of stone and oil. Flood lamps burned harshly, turning sweat into shining streaks on their skin. Darren Voss stepped carefully over a coil of power cable, ducking beneath a scaffold. The cavern opened before him, a cathedral hollowed out of rock, scaffolding suspended like ribs across its yawning height. At the center, stripped mining rigs had been reborn into construction frames. The skeleton of a frigate lay anchored to the floor, its hull half-plated with dull sheets that reflected none of the light around it. Men hammered with urgency, each strike ringing in the dust-choked air. The sound was neither ceremonial nor rhythmic. It was driven, hurried, and edged with fear. They've started sweeping thermal bands again, Voss said, his words pitched to carry without shouting. His gaze tracked the workers, then found Dask on a gantry above. Your vents need to hold. Dask wiped grime across his cheek, leaving a dark streak. His eyes, sharp and restless, never left the half-finished frame. They will. I've bled 3 crews over the last week testing the cycle. Waste heat drops get stored in the sinks, released hours later through a scatter of valves along the outer rock. To the council it will look like random fissures cooling. He paused, then added with a bluntness only he carried. But the men don't believe that yet. They think the first frigate will light us up like a beacon. Voss descended the stairs, his boots crunching against loose gravel. He came level with the ship's half-built hull, resting his palm against the cold plating. Belief doesn't build ships. Your system does. Keep them moving. A miner, helmet lamp trembling, shuffled close. His hands were calloused, his voice low. Commander, if we're discovered. His throat worked as though the words weighed heavy. My children sleep 3 levels above this cavern. Will the council know? Voss met his stare. He didn't soften, but neither did he dismiss. If the council knows, none of us walk out. That is why you'll finish the venting arrays exactly as Dask ordered. Every bolt sealed, every cycle timed. You're not just building a ship, you're burying your family beneath a shield. The man nodded and returned to work, shoulders squared by obligation heavier than stone. Hours later, in the operations chamber carved into the rock wall, a heads-up display flickered with pulsing red arcs. Auric, the signals officer, leaned over the console. Thermal sweep incoming. They're targeting the equatorial belts first, probably expecting makeshift forges. Dask leaned across him, calloused fingers stabbing at a chart. Activate the blooms. Voss folded his arms, watching as operators triggered controlled vents in distant, abandoned quarries. On the display, false flares blossomed across the surface, like wounds opening under the Council's gaze. The enemy's sensors would register them as inefficient smelters or collapsing machinery. Meanwhile, the true yards remained buried in silence, their heat bleeding into hidden reservoirs. Good, Dask muttered, though his brow stayed furrowed. They'll think us sloppy. They underestimate a man who's shoveled ore for 20 years. Minutes dragged until the sweep passed. The Council frigates glided on, satisfied with their illusions. The chamber exhaled as one, but Voss's tone cut the relief short. This will not be the last sweep. They will adjust, refine, try again. We must stay ahead. In the mess hall later that night, the miners ate in weary silence, spoons clinking against metal bowls of thin stew. Voss moved among them, his presence breaking the stillness. A young worker lifted his head, his cheeks hollow, his eyes ringed with fatigue. Why us, Commander? Why miners? Voss crouched, his hand firm on the table. Because you already know how to carve life from rock. The Council thinks weapons grow only in factories. They never understood men who build with their hands. Every ship that rises from your caverns will carry your fingerprints, and when they fly, your families will know they were not victims of this blockade, but its answer. The mess hall filled not with cheers, but with a heavy, nodding silence. Pride mingled with fear. They would work. They would keep secrets. Dask caught Voss outside, where lamps cast long shadows against the carved walls. His voice was quieter than it had been earlier, stripped of command. You promise them survival, but you and I know discovery means fire from orbit. Voss's gaze followed a stream of dust trickling from a crack overhead. He thought of Kalen crushed in a riot, of the boy in the ration line wearing his brother's patch. If we promise them nothing, they break before the first ship sails. If we promise survival and buy time, maybe, just maybe, we earn the chance to turn this ring around their throats. The engineer nodded, eyes grim. Then I'll keep building in silence. Days turned into weeks, and the caverns multiplied. From old salt mines in Europe to hollowed asteroids dragged into shadowed orbits, Earth transformed scars into shelters, pits into shipyards. Workers carried their drills not with resignation, but with iron resolve. Children drew ships on cavern walls, crude outlines of hulls rising like guardians from rock. Mothers hushed them, whispering that silence was life. One evening, as Voss inspected a cavern near the Andes, the ground rumbled with a deeper tremor than drills should cause. Lamps swung, dust fell thick, men cried out. The radio crackled with Auric's clipped tone. Council sweeps intensified. They're pulling slow passes near your site. Voss looked at Dask, whose lips pressed into a line. Time to test the cycle, the engineer muttered. He barked orders, and vents hidden in mountain crevices released controlled plumes, faint mist curling into the night sky. On the orbital charts, the Council registered only natural geothermal discharge. The frigate slid past. The cavern held its breath until their lights faded. When silence returned, a cheer broke out among the men. They had fooled the enemy once again. Voss did not cheer. He touched the cold stone of the cavern wall, feeling it vibrate faintly under the hidden ship's unfinished heart. Every day we survive like this, he whispered to himself, is a day closer to showing them what survival really means. And somewhere above, the Council swept their gaze across Earth, seeing only false fires, while deep below the surface, the true heat of defiance gathered unseen. They aren't flawless, not even close. Oryx slammed a data pad onto the briefing table, its surface flickering as the laser plasma display absorbed his input. The miners turned shipwrights, soldiers, and pilots crammed into the stone he. One chamber stopped mid-conversation, eyes turning toward the signal officer. Sweat beaded on his forehead, more from the heat of the crowded cavern than nerves, though his hand trembled faintly as he pointed at the map materializing above the table. Voss leaned forward, hands braced on the edges. "Show me where." Oryx zoomed the projection. Orbit lines crisscrossed Earth like glowing scars. Red arcs represented Council frigates in patrol formation, sliding across long orbital paths. Between them, tiny flickers of dark blue pulsed. Gaps, measured in seconds, stretched thin as razor cuts. "Their patrol orbits overlap, but they aren't adaptive," Oryx said, his voice tightening with urgency. "Every cycle, same sequence. They rely on standardized sweeps and cross-check handoffs. The net closes tight, but not perfect. I've logged telemetry across 2 months, tracked every pass, every lag. Here," he tapped, and the projection magnified to a sector near the equatorial arc. "A patrol clears one zone 38 seconds before the next arrives. Add drift, add relay lag, you get a full 67 seconds, a blind minute." The chamber stirred, boots shifting on stone, murmurs sparking. Dask folded his arms, grime staining the sleeves of his coat. "A minute in vacuum isn't survival. You can't push a convoy through on scraps of time." Oryx didn't flinch. 1 minute isn't enough for a convoy, but several strung together? A corridor stitched from blind spots? That's how we break them. Voss studied the projection, his jaw taut. "You're saying we can move ships between gaps, hopping one window to the next?" "Exactly. They expect us to smash through the wall. Instead, we slip through the cracks." Oryx's voice hardened, more daring than before. "We can weave an entire convoy past their noses if timing holds." Silence pressed close as the weight of the idea settled. Miners' children hidden under caverns depended on food that could no longer be imported. Crews building warships needed alloys Earth couldn't forge alone. And morale, bleeding thin after months of blockade, needed something stronger than promises. Voss finally spoke. "Then we test your blind minute. But not with ore, not with munitions. We send food first. If the Council finds us, at least we'll die feeding our people." The convoy prepped in a concealed bay carved into a frozen crater. Crates of grain, dried legumes, and powdered nutrients filled cargo holds normally reserved for metals. Pilots strapped themselves into chairs patched with old straps and frayed cushions. Engines sat cold, waiting for ignition while crews whispered to each other, voices clipped by fear and necessity. Voss walked the line of ships, his boots crunching across frost. He stopped by one pilot sealing her harness. "If you feel panic, breathe. Timing matters more than speed. Keep formation no matter what." She looked up, eyes fierce though rimmed with fatigue. "Commander, you believe this works?" He held her gaze. "I believe in Oryx math. But more than that, I believe the Council doesn't see you yet. Let's make sure they don't." Across the bay, Oryx hunched over his console, one hand tracing patterns across the glowing overlay. His voice piped into headsets. "Mark your chronometers. Blind window 1 in 89 seconds. If you drift a fraction late, the corridor collapses." Dask leaned against a support strut, arms crossed, watching Voss. "You realize if one of them lags, the whole line lights up like a beacon." Voss's reply was quiet. "Then none of them will lag." The first burn lifted the convoy from the crater, a muffled shudder rippling through the ground. Heads-up displays inside cockpits lit with coordinates scrolling in sharp succession. Crews clenched jaws, hands white-knuckled on throttles. The black sky outside looked empty, but everyone aboard knew Council corvettes prowled just beyond reach. "Window 1 now," Oryx's voice cut steady across the channel. Pilots accelerated, ships gliding into the corridor. On the displays, enemy orbits crawled close, their thermal scans combing Earth's night face. The convoy darted forward in silence, hearts pounding louder than any vibration. Inside her cabin, the young pilot Voss had spoken to earlier pressed her cheek to a cracked cushion, watching stars streak by. Sweat rolled into her collar, salty against dry lips. Her mind raced with Oryx's countdown, 40 seconds to clear, 20 seconds before the next patrol angle swept past. They slid through. Window 2 in 44 seconds, Oryx ordered, his tone clipped but even. Vector 5 degrees port. Hold burn to 6.3. The pilots obeyed, their ships adjusting, engines flickering faint traces hidden against Earth's glare. One misstep would have cast radiation spikes across Council's sensors, but the line held. In the operations cavern, operators stared at the projection, breath frozen in their chests. Red arcs passed close, so close the system overlaid collision warnings. Dask muttered under his breath, his engineer's instinct rebelling against chance. Voss didn't blink, eyes locked on the progress markers. The convoy entered the third blind. One frigate shifted unexpectedly, engines firing a brief correction. Gasps rang in both cavern and cockpits. "They're randomizing," Dask hissed. Oryx's fingers flew over controls, recalculating vectors. "Stay steady. Adjust heading 2 degrees starboard. Trust me." The convoy slid just beyond the new sweep. Council sensors reading only empty drift. Silence returned, brittle but intact. Minutes stretched like hours until the final blind gaped open. "Oryx," his voice cracked once, then steadied. "Final window, 93 seconds. The convoy surged, engines firing in staggered bursts to mask heat. The Council's lattice closed behind them, arcs overlapping again. Ahead lay the unpatrolled corridor, raw space beyond the blockade. Voss exhaled, realizing he had been holding breath since launch. "They made it," he said softly. In the cockpits, pilots cheered, relief tearing loose in ragged laughter. One unlatched her harness mid-drift, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Grain, legumes, powdered food, all of it was sailing free, safe. Families would eat. Back in the cavern, miners lifted their heads from bowls of cold stew as word spread. For the first time since the blockade began, faces cracked into smiles. Voss stood before them, voice steady but carrying more weight than any speech before. A convoy slipped through. Oryx's blind minute held. Today proves we can move. Tomorrow, we'll move more. Dask approached Oryx afterward, clapping a rough hand on his shoulder. "You found cracks in a wall I thought unbreakable." Oryx shook his head, eyes still locked on data streams. "The cracks will close. They'll adapt." Voss joined them, tone even but steel beneath. "Then you'll find new ones. That is how we live, threading their blindness until our ships grow strong enough to blind them in turn." The three men stood together in the glow of shifting displays, while above them the Council patrols circled unaware. For the first time since the blockade, Earth's people carried more than stubborn defiance. They carried proof that hope could be engineered, timed, and flown through the narrowest of corridors. And somewhere in the silence beyond patrol arcs, a convoy of food-bearing ships sailed unseen, their trails already fading into the dark. "They're going for the relays!" Oryx's voice rang through the command cavern, sharp enough to cut through the murmur of crews crowding around consoles. The laser plasma displays lit up, showing red arcs converging on Earth's orbit. Small blue icons flickered as Council ships tore into them one after another. Sparks cascaded across one of the feeds before it went dark, leaving only static snow. Voss stepped forward, jaw set, eyes narrowing as he watched another relay icon vanish. "They want us blind. No trade signals, no coordination, no hope of outside contact." He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it pressed every man in the chamber. Dask spat on the ground, fists tightening. "We built those out of scrap and sweat, and they're treating them like clay pigeons." "They're doing more than shooting toys," Oryx replied, his fingers flying over his console. "Each hit teaches them what to expect. They're logging, cataloging. They'll burn every relay until silence chokes us." Voss's eyes hardened. "Then let them learn lies." By dawn cycle, Old derelict relay frames were being dragged from hidden stockpiles. Rusted shells, long since gutted of working circuits, were patched just enough to broadcast simple beacons. Crews worked in silence, torches hissing, welding plates into place. The smell of scorched insulation clung to the cavern walls. Voss walked among them, hand brushing one fractured frame that still bore scratches from its last orbit. He turned to Dask. "Can you rig these to sing just loud enough?" The engineer smirked grimly, wiping grease from his brow. "They'll scream like newborns, short bursts, easy targets. Council gunners will think they've cut us down." Oryx stepped in, holding a datapad brimming with telemetry charts. "If we scatter them across orbit and trigger bursts sequentially, the Council's algorithms will reinforce false confidence. Their doctrine depends on reliable kill logs. Feed them enough staged targets, and I can map exactly how they prioritize strikes." Voss looked between them, voice steady though burdened. "Do I? But crew them. A lifeless shell doesn't bleed convincingly on sensors. Council expects casualties." The room froze. Men exchanged glances, shoulders tightening. Finally, one mechanic whispered, "You're asking for volunteers." Voss nodded once. "Yes." When the first decoy relays went live, they lit up the Council's sensors like flares in the night. Predictably, corvettes adjusted orbits and closed in. From the cavern, the operators watched on displays as Council plasma fire turned the decoys into blazing wrecks. In the control seat of one decoy, Sergeant Halvik gripped his harness. His hands shook, but his voice didn't falter as he broadcast, "Relay Echo 7 reporting under heavy fire." Static drowned his words moments later. Voss stood silent, fists locked behind his back, as Echo 7's beacon winked out. Oryx's face was pallid under the glow of the displays, but his voice was crisp. "Their gunners logged it as destroyed. They're flagging at high value. Doctrine confirmed." More icons vanished in sequence. Foxtrot 1, Lima 9, Delta 12. With each erasure, Oryx updated his mapping of Council heuristics. Patterns emerged, strikes clustered on bursts that imitated orbital alignment corrections. Targets that went silent mid-transmission were prioritized even more heavily. By the third day, Oryx turned to Voss, eyes gleaming with exhausted triumph. "I know their playbook. Every move, every waiting. They think they're silencing us. In truth, they've taught me where to hide our real networks. The mesh can vanish during sweeps, rejoin when the patrols leave, and they won't even see it." Voss nodded, but his shoulders stayed heavy. At what cost? The cavern smelled of oil lamps and damp stone when Voss sat down at the crude desk. A stack of paper rested before him. Paper, because some messages deserved to endure fire and electromagnetic pulse alike. He picked up a pen, his hand hovering before the first stroke. "To the family of Sergeant Halvik." The words came slowly. Each letter carried weight heavier than any orbital strike. He wrote of sacrifice, of purpose, of how Halvik's courage fed the survival of millions. He didn't write of how Halvik's screams still echoed in Voss's ears, or how his name was bait to trap arrogant hunters. That truth he carried alone. Hours bled away. Letters filled the stack. One for each man who had volunteered. Voss's hand cramped, ink smudged across his calloused fingers. Dask found him still writing, lanterns burning low. "You can't take this all on yourself," Dask said quietly. Voss didn't look up. "They gave their names to history. I'll make sure those names are spoken with honor, not forgotten in logs as relay noise." Dask's jaw tightened. "And when the next round comes? When Oryx asks for more bait?" Voss set the pen down, finally meeting his gaze. "Then I'll ask again. Because that's what command is. Carrying the burden no one else can." When the Council reviewed their kill reports, admirals across their chamber halls congratulated one another. "Earth's voice is gone," one declared, pointing to the flood of destroyed relays logged in the system. "They cannot coordinate." Meanwhile, under the mountain, Oryx mesh nodes flickered quietly to life. They whispered across frequencies invisible to Council heuristics, transmitting supply routes, ship positions, and coded morale broadcasts. Pilots received messages on their heads-up displays for the first time in weeks. Families deep underground read short texts confirming their sons and brothers still lived. The Council had cut Earth's tongue, or so they thought. In truth, they had sharpened it. Voss stepped back into the cavern as new data streamed across the plasma walls. For the first time, he saw crews smiling through exhaustion. Auric met his eyes. "They think they've silenced us." Voss answered softly, his throat tight. "Let them keep thinking that. We keep speaking louder than ever." But when night returned and the cavern emptied, Voss sat alone with the stack of letters. He laid them one by one in a metal box, sealed it with his own hands, and set it in the memorial alcove carved from bedrock. The Council had tried to erase Earth's voice, but the voices of the fallen echoed on, carried in ink, in memory, and in the determination of those still fighting. And Voss knew with brutal certainty, hope would cost more lives before it bought freedom. "They're starving us from the inside," Pike muttered, slamming a crate onto the stone floor so hard the nails shivered loose. His beard was ragged, his eyes sleepless. Families trading bread for a vial of antibiotics, children cutting rations in half and still waking up hollow. If we keep losing food faster than we can hide it, the Council won't need bombardments. They'll let hunger finish the siege for them. Voss stood across the room, arms folded, face unreadable. Around them the chamber smelled of dried sweat and damp concrete, the air thick with the sour tang of spoiled grain stacked in corners. His gaze swept across the half-open crates of confiscated goods, salt, flour, black tins of preserved meat, enough to stretch a week if rationed properly, or 2 days if lost to street markets. Auric's eyes darted between them, hands restless against his datapad. "Markets are multiplying faster than we can close them. One gets burned, another sparks up 3 alleys away. We need more than force." Pike leaned over the table, pointing to the scribbled maps scrawled on paper scraps. "Force isn't the plan. We let them think they're winning. I've already seeded decoy shipments, flour sacks laced with trackers, tins with embedded tags. They'll move them through their corridors, and when they do, I'll see the skeleton of their networks." Voss narrowed his gaze. "You'll bait them with food when mothers line up outside soup hall." The old smuggler's jaw worked, teeth grinding. "If we don't cut the arteries, the Council bleeds us dry anyway. Better we take their roots and flip them to our favor." In the weeks that followed, Pike's plan unfolded like a shadow war beneath the streets. His teams carried bags that looked ragged but rang heavy with hidden transmitters. He let whispers leak through backrooms and alleys. A convoy moving south, a stash near the aqueducts, a crate of dried fruit under the old tram station. Street urchins darted through alleys with word, and hungry men with rifles followed. Pike sat hunched over a battered receiver, chewing on a strip of leather while the tracer signals flickered across the laser plasma display. "Got you," he whispered as glowing lines spidered into patterns of supply corridors. Tunnels carved from abandoned sewer lines, rooftops strung with pulleys, couriers blending with refugees. Auric leaned over his shoulder, eyes wide with growing understanding. "This isn't random desperation. It's orchestrated. They're building a mirror logistics chain beneath us." Voss's voice rumbled low, tight with frustration. "And the Council applauds it." Indeed, within a month, Council broadcasts blared across seized channels, showing images of ragged men tied to posts, boxes of food labeled contraband aid. On their glowing screens, uniforms pointed accusing fingers at profiteering smugglers, declaring themselves enforcers of order while painting Earth's hunger as self-inflicted. The cavern echoed with silence as crews watched those broadcasts. A woman spat on the ground. "They're using our thieves as proof of their mercy." Voss turned off the feed with a curt gesture. His eyes met Pike's across the room. "If we let them own the story, we lose, not only food, faith." The first tribunal took place in the broken shell of a civic hall. Stone columns scarred by bombardment rose like teeth around the chamber. Hundreds pressed into the cracked floor, the air reeking of smoke from oil lamps and the sour musk of bodies pressed too close. On a raised platform, the accused stood shackled. One was a gaunt man who once wore a baker's apron, another a former constable with soot on his hands. Their eyes darted across the crowd, caught between fear and defiance. Voss stood tall, his voice steady but raw as he faced them. You carried food not to the children wasting in the slums, but to the hands of profiteers who sold it for coins. You fed greed when you could have fed mouths. Gasps and angry cries rose from the crowd. The smell of sweat and anger burned sharper than the torches. Pike leaned in Voss's ear, murmuring, "Make it count. Don't just punish them. Redirect the fire." Voss raised his hand, silencing the chamber. Their goods will not rot in council vaults, nor will they vanish into black markets. Every tin, every grain, will go where it was meant, from the hands of the few to the stomachs of the many. The roar that answered shook the cracked rafters. Families clapped, children shouted, and for the first time in weeks, hope filled the stale air. Trucks rolled at dawn, carrying confiscated supplies into districts long written off as starving. Voss walked beside the first convoy, boots crunching on gravel, while gaunt faces peeked from shattered windows. The scent of fresh bread rose as loaves were cut and handed out. Children squealed with laughter, biting into crusts so hard they scraped their gums. At one corner, a boy not older than 12 tugged at Voss's coat. His face was smeared with soot, eyes too old for his age. He held out a tattered fabric square stitched with a faded emblem, the patch of Voss's fallen brother's unit. "I found it in the rubble," the boy whispered. "He was yours, wasn't he?" Voss's throat closed, his chest a knot of stone. He crouched, hand trembling as he touched the patch. "He was mine," he said softly. "And now, it's yours." The boy clutched it tight, eyes shining as though it were a crown. Voss straightened, the crowd blurring before him, and for a moment the war's weight cut deeper than any weapon. That night, in the cavern, Pike laid another map across the table. The tracer lines now arced differently, not criminal corridors, but channels diverted into sanctioned supply. "We've turned their greed into our lifeline. Families eat. Districts breathe again." Auric added, "And the council's optics? They've lost control. Our tribunals spread faster than their broadcasts. People see thieves unmasked, food restored, leaders standing with them. Their siege now looks like theft." Voss stared at the map, then at the patch lying folded beside his hand. He could still feel the boy's grip, still hear his whisper. "If hunger was meant to break us," Voss murmured, "then we'll make sure it forges us instead." The cavern's torches sputtered, shadows leaping high across the stone. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of siege, but in that chamber, something different swelled, a sense that survival wasn't only about tactics or routes, it was about turning the very teeth of despair into tools of defiance. And though Voss's heart still carried the burden of every letter written to grieving kin, he understood with painful clarity that the streets themselves had now become part of the battlefield. The council could starve Earth's skies, but its markets, its alleys, and its children would answer back. "Hook that courier before the field shifts." Pike's order cracked across the salvage bay, cutting through clanking harnesses and the rattle of magnetic boots. The shuttle slipped from the mountain cavern into a ring of debris, shards spinning as frost sparked along their edges. Darren Voss stood at the airlock with his helmet sealed, fingers flexing around a tether while the scent of cold rubber and machine oil pooled inside his suit. "Targets on your heads-up displays," Auric said. A triangle pulsed on every visor, marking a mangled council courier drifting beside a scorched antenna. "Range 30 meters, Mercer grunted. "Crosswinds from venting scrap." The shuttle trimmed drift. The deck quivered under the cable's pull. Pike launched the grapple. The line whispered through a guide, then snapped taut when the claws found purchase on a crushed rib. Hold, Voss warned. Let the spin settle. He watched ash swirl around the hull, sunlight knifing across torn plates, bolts tumbling like silver hail. The hatch stuck on the first try. Mercer set a cutter to the seam. Sparks stung his sleeves. A stale draft rolled across their faces when the panel finally yielded. Inside, broken struts floated among glittering fragments. A glove drifted past like a lost hand. "Mind your footing," Pike said. "One kick and you're a pinball." Auric guided himself toward the comms rack, palms sliding over handholds polished by years of use. "Found the spine," he murmured. "Power's gone, but the cores may have survived." He pulled a panel and showed a block nested behind blast baffles, frost crusting the edges. "If this box still carries fleet broadcast keys, older standard, not command, we'll read how they speak to crews." Cole's lamp swept across the cabin wall. Bodies hung in restraint straps, cheeks hollow, hair drifting in slow curls. The team fell quiet. Voss steadied the nearest sailor, worked the buckle free, and took the man's insignia bar, etched with a simple sigil, slipping it into a pouch. "Gather them," Voss said, voice rough. "We don't leave anyone circling alone." Auric freed the core with careful hands. "I'll need Dask's clean room and every analyst who can keep a pencil straight," he said, threading a cable through the D-ring. "Council patched flag channels long ago, but legacy ship-wide announcements remain. Old habits outlive reforms." The shuttle rocked as the grapple reeled them in. Grit crunched under boots when they hauled the block aboard. Pike sealed the "Disentlement." "Ox, take us home." The bunker lab ran hot. Solvent hung in the air, heated plastic over benches. Dask rolled the core onto a padded cradle. Auric stripped his gloves and reached for drivers with unsteady fingers. Laser plasma displays bloomed with schematics and notes. Dask tilted his head. "You sure this fossil sings?" "It will if we learn the grammar," Auric answered. He cracked the casing, drew out a data wafer, and held it to a lamp. "Fleet broadcast layer, not fire control, public orders and morale speech, map phrasing and cadence, and we surf along the hull without scraping paint." Pike snorted. "In street words?" "We'll know when they eat, when they rotate, when they mourn," Auric said. Voss stepped close. "We listen first. No live play until we could write their bulletin ourselves." "Agreed," Auric said. "A patient hunt." They set to work. Analysts rebuilt frames, teased checksums back into shape, and aligned timestamps with patrol records from the blind minute studies. A rhythm emerged: daily calls, weekly addresses, rotation notices, memorials. Auric pinned markers against the patrol wheel. Habits appeared like footprints in snow. Word spread about the bodies in the courier. Men drifted to the lab doorway and stood with caps in hand. Dask cut a plank from a crate, planed it smooth, and hammered it to the wall outside the lab. He carved the names from the manifest. When the list ended, he added 2 plain words: honored adversaries. At dusk, they brought stones from the river and set them beneath the plank. Pike cleared his throat and stayed quiet. Auric stood with fingers laced. Voss laid the insignia bar on the stones and bowed his head. The corridor smelled of wet canvas and rock dust. Later, Auric slid the wafer under the lamp again. "They sanitized the new channels," he said. "The old bones remain." Dask handed him a mug that tasted of roasted roots and ash. "You'll have them humming your tune before this ends." Voss stood in the doorway. "We're not writing music, we're reading diaries. The first wrong note tells them we were here." He glanced at the plank. Anyone who died in that hull believed he guarded something worth the cost. Night in the bunker brought its own noises. A trolley rattling down a corridor, talk behind a door, the click of switches as lamps winked out. Auric stayed with the wafer, fitting shapes together until message forms settled. He imagined kitchens aboard blockade ships, the scrape of cutlery on tin, tired officers reading orders to crews who had memorized every line. Between watch changes, he pushed back and rubbed his eyes. The display showed broadcast pathways arcing between command hulls and pickets. He saved the graph and whispered, "We're inside the rhythm." Voss lingered in the memorial alcove, fingertips on the insignia bar. He saw Kalen's grin, the boy with the patch, bred at dawn. Those memories anchored him while plans unfurled, raids timed to meal hours, convoys sliding between morale calls, messages slipped into cracks when guards looked away. Above the mountain, the blockade wheeled through another day of siege. Inside the rock, a slower movement gathered. Careful hands turning keys in old locks, patient eyes learning how an enemy breathes. No hijack tonight. Discipline would hold until knowledge ripened. When Auric killed the lamp, the plank caught the corridor's glow. Stones sat cool beneath his palm. He nodded to sailors he would never meet, then returned to the bench to continue the labor of decoding a war carried in words. "Launch the decoys," Voss said, voice clipped as laser plasma displays washed the chamber in restless light. "Hit every window Auric marked. Make them think food is running again." Pike signaled the bays. Marker lamps blinked in sequence. Cargo hulls slid from shadowed cradles, holds packed with sacks that honest but rang hollow when knuckles tapped steel. Auric watched timing bars crawl, eyelids raw from another night over charts. "First Watu's Guas. Have goes in 60, he said. "Council patrols will smell a headline and drift." The decoys rose from a crater rim and drifted into the stitched corridor. Heads-up displays showed patrol paths crawling like serrated blades. Crewmen licked dry lips, tasting filters. In the mountain, Dask hunched over an auxiliary screen, grease under his nails, whispering for ships built by hands that once carried drills. "They'll bite," he muttered. "They need a trophy." They did. Patrols that should have held station slid outward, noses lifted by the promise of victory. Auric fed a clipped update into the net. "Interceptors abandoning sectors 4 and 7. Confirm stretch." A junior tactician answered, breath raking. "Confirmed. Lines thin along the belt." Moments later, propaganda flooded the legacy channel the analysts had mapped, officers rehearsing captions for captures not yet made. Counselor Dorn's signature sat on the order pushing them to perform for cameras. Voss didn't grin. "He's yanked their leash," he said. "Good. Pull them farther." Pike launched the second string. Decoys blinked on cue, went quiet, then flared again, mimicking smugglers who feared patrols but needed coin. The lattice deformed another notch. Auric tapped the display with a knuckle. "One more wedge and a seam opens near the high-latitude band. That's our lane." The carrier waited beyond a scarred rock where sunlight rarely reached. Crew strapped in without banter, buckles scraping fabric, breath fogging before scrubbers settled rhythm. Coil banks lay quiet under armored covers, fed by months of hoarded power. The projectile rested within rails the color of ash, its long body inert as a tombstone. The gunner, Kerr, kept his hands flat to stop a tremor. Voss rode the encrypted line. "One shot only. Confirm." Kerr swallowed. "1." Auric's countdown threaded every ear. "Ambush lane forms in 20. Patrol eyes Auya." Dorn is directing documentary crews," Voss answered. "We'll provide another kind." The lane yawned wide enough to swallow a blade. Kerr steadied himself, thumb hovering. Auric called target data with the cadence of a metronome. "Destroyer on wedge flank, forward shields heavy, aft screens soft. Recommend Delta 3 to keep debris away from civilian arcs." Voss closed his eyes for one heartbeat, seeing his brother's name on the plank, then opened them again. "Take it." Kerr exhaled and squeezed. The cabin shivered as rails spat a spear no wider than a man's thigh. There was no flash. Restraints tugged, stomachs twitched. On the tactical display, the spear became a hairline tracing, then a white pinprick at the destroyer's waist. For a moment, nothing changed. Then hull plates slid apart with eerie grace, a seam widening through decks, light spilling from ruptured corridors before snuffing as systems failed. Two halves drifted, frames unraveling while escape pods vomited sparks and tiny silhouettes shoved free. Silence held the carrier like a fist. No cheering. Pike's jaw worked and settled. Dask stared at the display, throat tight, a builder watching a thing undone beyond repair. Auric whispered without meaning others to hear, "So fast." Voss set a hand on the rail to steady himself. The weapon had stepped off the page and into the world. "Kill the lane," Voss ordered. "Shut every whisper. Dump heat into rock. Bleed the bank slow. We vanish." Kerr complied, fingers careful, as if any hurried motion might wake the sky. The carrier slid backward into deeper shadow. Far out, escorts clawed for bearings, formation unraveling as voices overlapped. Auric translated bursts over the old stream. "They think a mine took it, then a missile, then sabotage. 3 stories, none true." Pike leaned toward a mic. "Second shot while they spin?" "Negative," Voss said. "1 strike teaches fear, 2 teaches where we hide." He looked around the bay, greasy overalls, scarred knuckus, less, eyes that had forgotten sleep. "We're not collecting trophies, we're shortening sieges." Council patrols widened again, hunting ghosts. Decoys winked out on command, then lit in distant sectors, dragging wedges like fishermen teasing a net. Dorn, thirsty for film, pushed subordinate captains to chase faint returns. Auric cut the smuggler's wire to a whisper. "Quiet now. Melt away." On the displays, the ring sagged into an untidy loop, coverage uneven, gaps blooming where doctrine swore none should exist. Voss leaned near Auric. "How long until they tighten?" "Hours," the signals man replied. "Maybe less if someone sober takes the board. Crews are rattled. You can hear it in the cadence." "Record that cadence," Voss said. "It's the sound of doubt." He turned to runners. "Shift contraband to sanctioned routes while their eyes rove. Feed districts that missed the last delivery. Move sick children first." Men bolted down stairwells slick with condensation. In the engine bays, coolant hissed through narrow pipes, leaving a coppery taste on tongues. On the ridge above the cavern mouth, the air bit cheeks and watered eyes. Far beyond clouds, a cut warship drifted apart, 2 halves glinting as sunlight found ragged edges. Kerr unbuckled slowly, palms steady now. Dask set a hand on his shoulder. "You aimed at steel," the engineer said quietly. "But men lived there." Kerr nodded once, eyes wet and stubborn. Voss paused beside the memorial box. He thought of the boy who wore Kalen's patch, of fathers trading sleep for guard shifts, of parents counting pills at kitchen tables. Power like this could end sieges. Power like this could end souls. The difference would lie in restraint. He returned to the rail and raised his voice. "We withdraw clean. We feed our people. We keep our promise." The carrier eased deeper into darkness, leaving behind a broken shape and a rumor that something, G in Earth's night, had teeth. "Hit them at perigee, inside the glare, inside the clutter," Pike ordered, voice flat as he stalked the raider bay. Frost smoked off lines of fuel hose, boots thudded on grated walkways. Men tightened harnesses with raw hands, while breath fogged their visors before scrubbers drew the mist away. Heads-up displays flickered awake across helmets, waypoints marching in hard angles. "Keep burns minimal," he added. "1 spark too high and their pickets sniff you from orbit." Voss stood beside the rail where the bay opened to the night. Below, Earth's curve threw a cold glow across hull plates. "Auric," he said without turning. "Give me the timing one more time." The laser plasma display above the catwalk painted the cavern in pale blue, lines and numbers stringing into a pulse map that felt like a heartbeat. "Refuel chains cross the limb every 91 minutes, Auric replied. "Tankers dip toward perigee to shorten transfer time. Patrol coverage has a wobble during the handoff. You slide into that depression, match speed, latch hard, cut the line, vector out on the dark side. If you're late by a blink, the window collapses." He tucked a pencil behind his ear and added, quieter, Crew rosters say most ships feed right after transfer. If you damage schedules, you don't just cut fuel, you cut eating hours. Pike spat into a drain, jaw bunching. Not proud work, he said. Necessary. He slapped a gloved palm twice on the nearest hull. Raiders, ready. They pushed off from the rock, thrusters twitching and pinpricks. Hulls trembled, straps bit ribs. In the cockpits, the air tasted like stale coffee and cold rubber. Men breathed through dry mouths, fought the itch along their shoulders they couldn't scratch under armor. Earth's limb filled half the view, throwing up a haze that made sensors stutter. Pike used that haze like a curtain, keeping his ships wedded to the brightness so patrol scopes caught glare instead of silhouettes. Target, Oryx said in every ear. Tanker designation Brant 7. Vector bearing -3, closing fast. On each heads-up display, a pale diamond drifted, growing fat as the raiders slid under it. Pike's lead craft kissed the tanker's shadow, magnets thudding along hull seams. The men heard the knocks through boot soles more than through air. Latch 1, Mercer grunted, then latch 2. Cables snaked out, teeth dug in, pumps chuffed. Fuel hissed into temporary bladders stuffed into cargo bays like sleeping whales. The sound filled cabins. Men tasted a cold chemical tang on tongues and swallowed against it. Voices bled through from the tanker's bridge, clipped, off balance, out of breath. Identify, a tight voice demanded over an open channel. Pike answered with a dead relay code Oryx had resurrected from a decade-old log. Silence. Then, "We read you. Proceed." 30 seconds later, a siren yelped somewhere forward as a watch officer realized the wrong relay sat on the line. Pike cut the hose. Bladders bulged. "Undock," he snapped. Magnets thumped free. The raiders sank back into the glow, then peeled away in a slow arc toward deeper night. On another vector, a second team went high and lost a handle when turbulence from the tanker's course correction buffeted their clamp. The hull slammed a forearm. A shout burst across comms, teeth clicked, a wrist cracked. Voss's knuckles went white on the railing, but the pilot recovered the line, wheeled and scraped magnet feet along the seam until the grip held again. "Latch restored," came through gritted teeth. He kept working. By the time patrols cleared the glare, the raiders had become tiny stones rolling downslope, quick and quiet. On the mountain, men dragged hoses over rails and bled fuel into buried tanks that sweated with cold. Dask supervised the meters, Lee, PS moving as he counted. "Enough to run the yards through 2 cycles, he said. He didn't smile. The council answered within a day. Patrols shored up the inner ring, stacked hulls until orbits looked like a chain laid flat, broadcasts on the Legacy channel hardened. Oryx translated in the operations chamber while the crew listened in silence. "Command announces ration discipline aboard Blockade ships, second meal reduced by 1/3. Transfers restricted to priority wedges." Then softer. "Mess halls told to stay open but cut portions. Maintain order." Pike's jaw worked while a recording replayed. The scrape of chairs, then nothing. Utensils slowed, then stopped. 100 men listening to an announcement they'd never expected to hear. One murmured, "Half again," and another whispered something about a child on a colony moon who would wait longer for letters because of fuel cuts. The room under the mountain felt colder than it had an hour earlier. "We keep raiding?" a young pilot asked, eyes fixed on the floor. Voss nodded once. "We do. We don't kill crews. We don't torch cargo. We take what keeps siege ships parked and feed it into our lifeline. If a tanker pilot heaves to, we mark him for pickup and send a beacon. If one fights to the last bolt, we break the line and leave him intact." Pike drew a breath like a man swallowing glass. "Interval disruption next?" Oryx brought up another plot, clean lines arcing between orbits and time marks. "They've kept the same refuel calendar for years. Not identical, but regular enough to predict pulses. Hit them out of phase and the wheel stutters. Miss 2 successive anchor runs in a sector, and you trigger a cascade. Ships start cannibalizing each other's slots. Captains panic. That's when rations tighten further. Schedule it, Voss said. We will not gloat. We will not mock men who go hungry. But we will end a blockade that brought graves to our doors. The second night came sharp and quick. Raiders threaded through debris that spun like knives. Auric counted windows in a calm monotone. Now, hold, burn. They clipped 2 tankers in a row and forced a third to drop transfer hoses early. Fuel splashed like quicksilver, beating and drifting away as shining bubbles. Pike watched those bubbles drift past his canopy and tasted bile. A picket finally saw them and charged with guns hot. Pike never went toward fire if escape existed. Down slope, he said, kicking his craft into the limb. The picket's sensor cone grazed his wake and lost him. The raiders rode the edge of light until darkness swallowed them. Back at the mountain, men unrolled maps while their forearms shook from the strain of wrestling hoses. Fuel gauges climbed. Auric's logs filled with gaps where interrupts had landed. Sector 8 missed 2 anchor runs, he reported. They'll move wedges from 3 to cover, which means 3 slips, and we can hit again. By dawn cycle, the blockaders made a new announcement. Auric's speakers clicked. The voice that followed tried to sound official and instead sounded tired. Fuel conservation measures extended fleet-wide. Mess services will scale portions in accordance with ship readiness. Unauthorized hot plates will be confiscated. Chairs scraped. Somewhere, a ladle clanged on a pot. Cutlery went quiet again. Someone muttered a joke that died on the table. Pike turned away from the speakers and pushed both palms against a bulkhead until his shoulders shook. I've stolen from smugglers, nobles, and cowards, he said to nobody, and I never once heard a room full of men go silent like that. Voss came up beside him. We didn't ask for this siege, he said. We didn't ask to listen to their kitchens. But if those kitchens feed ships that ring our skies, then we will make those spoons lay still. Pike nodded without speaking and went back to work. The third night, a tanker surrendered the moment clamps bit. Do not cut the crew, the captain said on an open channel, breath fast. We'll power down. Take what you want. Leave us alive. Pike logged the name, tagged the hull with a beacon for rescue, and sent medkits through a hatch before lines parted. The captain's thank you cracked midway through, as if a tightness in his throat finally gave way. When the raiders returned, Voss paced the bay while men coiled lines, hands raw, knuckles split. Fuel sloshed inside buried tanks with a low gurgle. Dask wiped a sleeve across his brow and stared at the meter lights until they steadied. Auric pinned another set of interval gaps to the board. The pattern had begun to fracture. The ring still held, but its ships were now fed by stutters and scraps. Enough for the yards? Voss asked. For 2 builds and a week of drills, Dask answered, voice burnt thin. Then we keep to the calendar, Voss said. We take their hours and give them to our children. Out beyond the ridge, dawn smeared pale color over ice. In mess halls on blockade hulls, men lifted bowls that weighed less than yesterday and pretended not to notice. In the mountain, cooks ladled thicker stew. The raiders slept on benches with boots still on, fingers grease-streaked, eyes rimmed red. Pike sat alone for a while, listening to the mountain creak and the soft slosh in pipes, and decided he would write the names of every tanker captain who powered down when asked. He didn't expect forgiveness. He expected an end, built from timing, fuel, and a quiet that meant siege ships could no longer circle forever. Push the packets now, Auric said, leaning over the console as the laser plasma display washed the cavern in cold light. Route them through the legacy morale layer, bounce off caches we mapped from the courier corps, keep captions local. Pike watched progress bars crane all across his heads-up display. They'll taste the truth before breakfast, he muttered. Show them our lines, show them which governors keep full plates. Voss stood behind them, shoulders tight. No taunts, he said. Give them faces and dates. Let the pictures speak. Clips opened on shipboard screens, winter cues, cooks ladling stew in school gyms, children laughing through steam, and a ledger of seized stock moved by tribunal order to districts that had received nothing in weeks. Then a second set. Banquet tables on warm stations beyond the ring, a governor's plate piled high while enlisted men compared empty bowls. Auric listened to reply traffic. Wardroom channel arguing, he said. Petty officers asking why supply chiefs dine off shift while deckhands skip meals. Minutes later, Admiral Vaynar's order rolled through the network. Firewall legacy feeds. Confiscate private caches. Report violators. Clamp away, Pike growled. You can't box gossip. Voss folded his arms. We never wanted their kitchens to empty. We wanted sailors to see the siege for what it is. He looked to Auric. How long until rumors reach the outer wedges? By watch change, Auric said. They whisper faster than cables carry. Dask entered with oil on his sleeves. Rails are cold and ready, he reported. Coil banks sit topped off. Voss nodded. We finish what the truth began. Break screens, avoid flagships. Stealth carriers slid from shadowed coverts into lanes Auric had opened with interval raids. Kerr strapped in, wiped damp palms on his trousers, and stared at the scope until sweat stung his eyes. Target 1, escort echelon 2, Auric intoned. Aft plates run hot, alignment loose, fire when the window forms. Kerr exhaled, counted, and tapped the trigger. The ship shivered as rails hurled a bolt. On the scope, a hairline drew across gray, then split the escort from keel to spine. The frame lifted away in ragged pieces, pods streaming like beads. Gun layers on the capital behind it froze, then overcorrected, weapons slewing toward a phantom threat. Shift, Voss ordered. Do not linger. An orbit later, another escort drifted, cut along a seam that left the main hull untouched. The screen that had felt like a wall now looked like a fence, with slats missing. Patrol captains argued about mines, sabotage, spies. Vayner barked for discipline and got clipped affirmations from men who sounded worn through. In the mountain mess hall, speakers leaked captured wardroom talk. A junior steward on a picket hissed, "Second meal halved, then halved again." A chief asked whether the Admiralty had reduced portions in their own dining rooms. Chairs scraped. Silence followed. Pike set his spoon down. I wanted their ships thirsty, not their crews hungry, he said. Voss met the room's eyes. Hungry crews can choose to live, he answered. A starving city cannot. Our children carry patches from men who died in bread lines. Remember who lit this fire. Dask oversaw cool-down cycles. Sparks snapped as crews bled heat into stone. He wiped grit from his lips and tried not to replay pods drifting like seeds. Auric brought Voss a short list. One corvette on the outer sweep has gone quiet without damage, he said. They're broadcasting a line. Standing down. Request boarding by Earth. Captain lists crew ages, medical conditions, adds 2 names for transfer home. Brothers. Pike looked up hard. He knows what we did for the tanker crews. Answer him, Voss said. Send the same terms. Weapons cold, hatches open, crew treated first, command last. No cameras. We record for evidence. Return their wounded with full kits. If they ask to stay, we make room. If they want passage out, we escort. Borders crossed with gloved hands visible. The corvette's air carried stale coffee and sweat. A medic pressed water pouches into shaking fingers. An older petty officer tried to stand at attention. A corpsman eased him to a bench and tied a bandage on a cracked heel. Voss waited on the channel. When the captain appeared, he had stubble on his jaw and raw eyes. We will not fire on your world, the man said. We will not die feeding a policy that starves sailors and children at once. Then you will live, Voss replied, and your crew will be treated with the same care I want for mine. Word of the surrender moved faster than any firewall. By evening watch, chatter across the outer arcs turned cautious. Escorts tightened around capitals without boldness. Gaps widened. The blockade still ringed the sky, but its steel felt thinner, hollowed by whispers and missing teeth. Auric leaned back while lines crawled across the display. "We changed the shape of their fear," he said, "not by burning the biggest ship, but by making every escort wonder whether the next bolt takes the hull next to him." Pike wrote the corvette's name on the same list where tanker captains already lived. "Add him to the page," he murmured. Voss walked to the memorial box, set his palm on the lid, and spoke quietly. "We are learning how to win without becoming what we hate." The cavern smelled of stew and hot rock. Boots scraped. Somewhere a baby laughed. The sound steadied him. "Resume rotations," he said at last. "Feed the districts that burned through their stores. Prepare messages for the families of crews who didn't come back. And Auric, keep the truth moving. Walls built from orders fall to whispers with names." In the barracks, crews folded blankets with careful hands and set boots in straight lines, as if order could anchor drifting hearts. Miners paused on ladders to hear the news and then climbed. Kerr sat alone in the carrier bay, counting breaths until his hands steadied. "Show me the checkmate," Voss said, stepping onto the lunar gantry where dust clung to boots like ash. The platform creaked under his weight. Frost rimed the rails. Soren HFY. Ted beside a circular hatch sunk into bedrock, visor scuffed, jaw set, gloves streaked gray from hours spent inside tunnels cut by charges and stubborn hands. Dask keyed the lock. Cold air rushed out with a bite like iron on the tongue. "We built it in pieces," he answered, leading Voss down a ladder into the barrel gallery. "A ring at a time, plate after plate. Every section hides under old mining claims. If they open a map, they see nothing but pits and paperwork." Lights warmed along the curve in a slow ripple. The barrel stretched away, a cathedral of concentric ribs disappearing into shadow. Workers moved along scaffolds, buckles clinking, faces smeared with lunar grime. Cables hung in neat runs, counterweights glided in their tracks with a whisper. The place smelled of machine oil and cold stone dust ground fine as flour. Beyond the far bulkhead, a control room glowed. Laser plasma displays painted the walls in harsh red lines that bent and crossed, a lattice of flight paths arcing from the Moon and Mars to chosen points in near space. Dask stopped before the biggest display. Angles, windows, sling solves tied to our tides and theirs. He tapped a red arc that left the barrel mouth, curved past Earth's limb, and hooked into empty orbit. "If they form for bombardment, we cut the hinge that holds their formation and take the breath out of their plan. But we only get clean shots when geometry favors us." Voss studied the board, then the barrel. He felt winded without moving, as if the room had leaned into him. "We need proof," he said, "not theory. We test today." Dask looked older than yesterday, new lines grooved around his mouth. "Derelict rock in the graveyard lane. If our figures hold, the strike spalls that target into sand, and nothing leaks toward home." "And Mars?" Voss asked. "Twins," Dask said. "Smaller bore, longer track. Their sky gives us longer throws. Both guns can sing together when the moment calls." The first crew entered the control booth and took stations. Heads-up displays slid down over eyes. Breath fogged the plastic and cleared. Dask called their name list without flourish. Auric's voice came thin from the uplink. "Recon probes loitering near Shackleton Shadow. They drift, they study. They haven't sniffed your heat." He paused. "Yet." Voss glanced at the ceiling. "We'll carry the test in their faces," he said. "Then bury the trace so deep their scopes taste rock." Dask put a hand on the lead switch. "Load the stone." In the barrel, a carriage lifted a tungsten slug no longer than a coffin and seated it against rails as thick as a man's leg. The lights dimmed as coil banks took current. Valves clattered. Someone coughed and winced at the dryness in the air. The moon steals water even from throats. "Target locked," called a tech, tongue caught between teeth. "Clear stations," Dask ordered. "Seal the throat." Bulkheads slid. Latches thumped through the hull like distant drum beats. Voss spread his stance and steadied one palm against the console edge. He could taste dust. He could hear the creak of harness webbing as workers braced. "Mark," Dask said. The release clapped through bone. The deck twitched. A low shiver ran the length of the barrel and crawled up Voss's legs. On the red board, a line leapt forward, looped through the sling arc, and met a small mark labeled with a date older than the siege. The impact came as a jag on the plot, then a bloom from the target feed. Gray rock split and flowered into glitter, then fell apart entirely, a cloud pulled thin by orbital drift. Auric whistled over the channel despite himself. "Clean," he said. "No debris on home paths." Dask sagged against the console and laughed once, a sharp, surprised bark without joy. "We've built something that can answer a fleet," he said, then added, flat, "and I hate that I love it." Voss didn't smile. "Pack the heat," he said. "Dump into sinks. Vent in trickles. Make the crater look like a mine." A cough. "Already bleeding?" a tech answered, tapping dials with knuckles reddened by cold. "Recon?" Voss asked. "Probes hanging in the dark," Auric replied. "Suspicious, not certain. They spin cameras, then drift." "Give them a show," Voss said. Dask picked up the external comm and adopted a contractor's drawl. "Loaders, shift the gravel. Haulers, bring the buckets. Schedule says 12 more carts before night." Within an hour, 3 excavator teams began roving the plain with rotating lights, crunching grit under tracks, dragging tarps over fake mounds. Complaints flew on open channels about jammed augers and broken belts. A foreman swore like a poet. The recon probes recorded an afternoon at a quarry while the true monster hid under their sensors and cooled in sips. Mars called in shortly after. Dask took the line, nodding at unfamiliar voices through static haze. "Red array reports fit," the coordinator said. "Rails seated. Wind picked up dust near the mouth. We've got enough cover to mask a short shot if you want a mirror test." "Do it," Dask said. "Small rock, far lane." The Martian feed came over the lunar board a minute later, another red curve meeting another stone that crumbled into a necklace of bright beads. The room breathed again. Voss clapped Dask's shoulder, not hard. "You ironed the math, now keep them blind." That night, Auric flagged a tiny engine burn creeping across the Shackleton rim. "Spec ops insertion," he said, too calm. "One pod, low thrust, falling into our dark." Dask swore. Voss lifted his chin. "Cut the lights on the plane," he said. "Keep the fake augers whining, but kill the ridge lamps. Security teams to Sector 3. Quiet shoes only." The pod nosed into a shallow ditch and belched 2 shadows in sleek suits. They moved well, measured steps, nothing wasted. Their rifles glinted once when a star found them. A security pair waited behind a lip of rock, mouths dry, hearts banging. One guard, Levin, a farmer's son who had welded half the barrel ribs, clucks, hit a patch at his collar as if it could steady his hand. "Hold," hissed their sergeant. "Let them commit." The intruders crept toward a maintenance hatch at the barrel's midline. One slung a charge. The other watched the sky like a wolf. A pebble rolled from a boot. The nearest shadow swung, weapon up. The sergeant fired. The fight cracked the plane wide open. Muzzle flashes winked, dust plumed, radios snarled. Voss listened from the gallery, counting seconds between bursts. "They'll try to pop the hatch," Dask said, already running. "If they get salt into the bearings, we'll lose alignment for days." "Seal the breach," Voss said. Dask rounded a corner into the maintenance passageway and found a flurry of bodies at the inner door. A thin jet of air hissed from a bullet groove. Ice crystals formed along the seam like rime flowers. Levin pressed both hands against the leak, shoulders shaking, teeth gritted, blood dotting the floor in tiny dark coins. "Get patch foam," Dask barked. "Empty," someone shouted. "We used it at the last bolt swell." The door groaned. The leak widened. Dask grabbed a plate, first of the barrel's lining, polished, waiting for the next section, and shoved it against the seam. Cold bit through his gloves. "Hold it," he growled. "Clamp it like you mean it." Levin slid beside him and pressed his body into the plate, cheek to steel. The hiss dulled. Another guard cranked a jack against the opposite wall and locked the plate in place. The air steadied. Shots faded outside. A flare lit the ditch, then died. The sergeant's voice came through, panting. "Two down. One ran. We've got him bleeding. Pulling back." Dask sagged, knees buckling. He turned to thank Levin and found the young man slumped, hands still flat on the plate, eyes unfocused. A small hole bloomed in his side where a shard had gotten through. Blood soaked the seam and turned gummy in the cold. "Stay with me," Dask said, voice gone hoarse. He tore at his pouch, found nothing that would matter, and looked up with a helpless rage that felt like a hot knife. Levin's lips moved. Dask leaned close to hear a whisper stick in the corner of his mouth. "Tell my father I held a wall," the young man said. Then his head sagged forward, chin resting on the metal he'd sealed. The room filled with the scrape of boots and the ragged sound of men trying not to sob. Dask wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and swallowed. He looked at the plate, smooth, bright, now marked by a smear that would never polish out. He reached into his jacket, pulled his engraving stylus, and scratched slowly along the edge. Levin Hale, last hand. Voss stood in the doorway, face set hard enough to crack. He didn't speak for long seconds. Then quietly, "We'll set his name in the barrel's first ring. Every round that leaves this gun passes him." Auric came on the channel. "Probes withdrawing," he said. "They saw a brawl by a quarry and a flare in a ditch. Your fake crew played it well." "Good," Voss answered, not looking away from Levin. "Let them file their report on broken augers." They carried the body to the memorial alcove they had carved in the lunar wall, where each plank already bore letters gouged into rough wood. The room smelled of cold stone and wax. Men stood with caps in hands. Nobody spoke until Dask did. Voice scraped raw. "He held a wall." Back in the gallery, the barrel cooled in tiny sighs that barely reached the ear. Dask touched the fresh etching again, then returned to his console and resumed calibrations with hands that trembled only once. Voss watched the red arcs settle, lines bending toward a future he had prayed not to need, and now could not refuse. Above them, recon drifted away, fooled by noise and glare. Inside the moon, a weapon waited under rock and grief, named by a single carved line that cut deeper than any orbit. They signed it, bombardment authorized. Auric didn't sit. He planted both hands on the console while the laser, plasma display flooded the chamber with crimson geometry. Counselor Dorn pushed it through. Admiral Vaynar's wedges are already forming. The map sharpened into angled clusters that rolled inward like jaws. Overlays listed fire control cues and timing ladders drawn straight from doctrine, the inner ring collapsing into a tighter belt, coverage thicker, but patterns stiff enough to read like a marching song. Voss took a breath that tasted of stale coffee and dust. "Blackout on my mark," he said. "Civil defense to shelter depth. Dask, Moon and Mars on the leash. We don't fire until they walk into our lanes." He raised his head and pitched his voice toward the runners clustered near the stairs. "Move." Boots hammered stone. Radios crackled. Somewhere in the mountain, power handlers pulled heavy levers that thumped through the rock like distant drum beats. On the lunar gantry, frost rimed Dask's visor as he jogged across the catwalk to the barrel gallery, palm skimming a rail cold enough to bite. The etching along the first ring caught the light. Levin Hale, last hand, and for a heartbeat he touched the letters with a thumb through thin glove and kept moving. "Rail's hot," he told the pit crew, breath fogging inside his helmet before the scrubbers cleared it. "Sling solves loaded. We wait." Heads-up displays dropped in unison. The crew answered without bravado, harness buckles clinking, tongues working against dry mouths. Auric's voice carried from the mountain. "Enemy alignment underway, wedges in triads, lead ships locking aim points over coastal grids, river junctions, power exchanges." He stabbed a knuckle against the board. Timing lays flat. They've tightened enough to trap themselves. He glanced sideways at Voss, a quick, haunted smile. Doctrine is a gift when fear makes it rigid. Make them confident, Voss replied. Feed them ours. He keyed a channel to every dist. Richt coordinator. Begin blackout sequence. 1 minute stagger by grid, north to south. Broadcast the drill code and the shelter pattern exactly as rehearsed. City lights guttered street by street, like a night tide carrying away a coastline. Elevators stopped and doors thudded as families shouldered packs and filed down stairwells. In a school gym repurposed as a shelter, a man with brick dust in his hair knelt to his son's level and tightened the boy's scarf until wool scratched his cheeks. The little one clutched a tin cup that smelled faintly of bleach from the last wash. "Listen for the warden," the father said, voice low, trying to keep it from shaking. "Follow the line. Keep your hand on my jacket." The boy nodded while a siren began to wail, a raw, rising note that crawled along the bones and made shoulders hunch without permission. In the command cavern, that same sound rose through ducts, and Voss felt his throat close. It was the identical pitch from the night Kalen's message had arrived from the riot. Long, mournful, hard to ignore, and harder to forget. He steadied his palm on the table edge and spoke into the microphone with deliberate calm. "Control to all districts. Lights out, doors sealed. Stay low. Wardens, count heads twice." On the outer orbits, bombardment wedges rolled into their grid slots. Inside the lead ship of the Spearhead, an officer with red-rimmed eyes read off checklists while a weapons chief sucked at a split lip and pressed fingers against a console that smelled faintly of heated plastic. Across the officer's screen, a morale channel briefly flashed a fragment that shouldn't have been there. 3 seconds of a soup line under an awning, rain drumming on canvas, a girl balancing 2 bowls and trying not to spill, and then a firewall reset replaced it with target codes. He cleared his throat and read on. Vaynar's voice followed, clipped and dry. "Maintain formation. Don't chase illusions. Wedge leaders, hold on the count." Auric listened, head cocked, filtering noise through the grammar he'd learned. From the courier's bones. "They're using the exact cadence from the manual," he muttered, almost to himself. "If they stay on that beat, they'll drift into our pre-solved windows like beads sliding into notches." He drew a line with his pencil and tapped a time mark. "There." Dask stood over the lunar board as arcs shifted, red bending toward white where solves closed. "Mars?" he asked. A flat reply came back through grit. "Dust over the mouth, but rails are within tolerance. Coil banks topping, crew strapped." "Hold tight," Dask said. A tech passed him a squeeze pouch that tasted like lukewarm broth and metal. He forced a swallow and set it aside. The air in the gallery had that dry, cold bite that cracked lips and made tongues heavy. On the ground, shelter wardens clicked through rosters. Paper rustled. Someone whispered a prayer into a sleeve and got a squeeze on the shoulder from a stranger in the dark. A baby hiccuped and settled. The concrete floor felt clammy through thin blankets. The air carried the scents of canned stew, wet wool, and disinfectant. Above, faint vibrations moved through foundations as heavy doors slid into their slots, latches biting. "Blackout complete in 47 of 50, Auric reported. "Last 3 districts late by seconds. They're catching up." He flicked to another channel. "Patrol pickets report Earth dark. Wedge logic says civilian grid collapse indicates fear. They are committing to punishment timetable." Voss tilted his head, listening to the rhythm in the enemy's count. "Now." He keyed a narrow-beam transmitter. "Light the decoys." On ridgelines far from any shelter, a line of fake emitters stood up and sang. Their signatures mimicked improvised batteries and hastily assembled command vans. Raised on masts, tightened by calloused hands, they painted clean little beacons into the sky. Wedge sensors, keyed to doctrine that reward. Visible threats, pivoted a fraction to bracket those lures. That tiny change finished the geometry Dask had drawn 100 times in chalk on a wall when the barrel was still ribs and hope. "Lane solved," Auric said, voice suddenly very quiet. "Lead wedges interlock at our angles. Their own compacting makes the corridors rigid. Copy, Dask answered. Moon arrays standing by. Mars arrays standing by. Voss closed his eyes for a heartbeat and saw Kalen's crooked grin, the boy with the patch, the tiny kitchen where 2 bowls sat empty. He opened them and looked around at men who had built ships in caverns, raided tankers with bleeding wrists, engraved a name on steel so cold it bit. Shelters? He asked. Count complete, said a warden over an open line that crackled with too many voices speaking all at once. We're full, doors sealed, men along the hall, kids under tables, no one outside. In the wedge spearhead, the officer lifted a hand and then put it down. The bridge smelled like stale coffee and overworked circuits. A mess runner paused in the doorway clutching a pot that had nothing in it and left without pouring. The weapons chief cleared his throat again and wished he hadn't. At the back, a sailor coughed into the crook of his elbow and murmured to the man beside him, not daring a joke because the last time he joked, the captain looked like he might break. Mark on target in 20, Oric announced. Firing lanes lock in 15, 10, 5. Dask raised his palm above the board without touching it, as if any contact would jar a number. He didn't look at the etched name. He didn't have to. It lived against his skin even with gloves on. Crew, on the note, he said, voice even. When the count hits, we do our work. In the mountain's shelter, the father pulled his son close as the siren dropped to a low wail between peaks. The boy's ear lay against his jacket and heard the slow, hard beat of a heart that refused to speed up because the man it belonged to wouldn't let it. A lantern hissed softly. Someone opened a tin and the smell of peaches spread like a memory of summer that made mouths water and eyes sting. A warden walked the aisle with a hand on the rail, boots clicking. Breathe, he said softly to anyone who met his eye. Hold your breath too long and you'll fall. Breathe with me. People breathed. Above them, the wedges settled into shape, confident in classroom timing. On the Moon and Mars, barrels waited under rock, rails warm, crews still. Voss watched the numbers fall and spoke into the only channel that mattered. Blackout holds, lures lit, lanes closed. He felt the old siren thread through his bones and let it anchor him rather than unmake him. On my command, he said, the words steady and heavy enough to carry across an ocean of dark. Release. Voss's word cut through the galleries and bays like a blade. On the Moon, Dask dropped his palm, and the barrel's coils answered with a hard, rising thrum that shook dust from ribs and sent a thin quiver up every spine in the gallery. At Mars, crews echoed the count and drove power into rails until warning lights glared white. In shelters below, wardens held breath as if lungs could steady stone. The first slug left the lunar throat with a crack that rattled teeth. Men felt it more than heard it. Boots skated a half step, harness webbing bit ribs, tongues tasted chalk. On the red geometry board, a bright line leapt, curved through the sling, and rushed to meet a corridor Oric had solved months earlier on paper yellowed by lamp heat. A twin stroke arrowed from the Martian mouth a heartbeat later, bent by a longer arc toward the same seam. Lead angles holding, Oric said, pencil tapping a steady cadence against the console. Wedges locked by their own timing. Mark. Now. The two impacts hit like fists through glass. Escort screens flared, died, and the front ranks shuddered as shocks ran through frames. A battleship listed as a glancing strike shaved armor and chewed antennas into scrap. Its escorts reeled and lost their tidy line. Carriers, go, Voss ordered. From shadowed rocks and cold bays, stealth hulls exhaled their first volley. Rods slid down rails and leapt away, invisible until they found steel. One tore an escort along its spine, another clipped a picket and spun it like a coin. A third kissed a flagship's tailplane and ripped sensors clean, leaving command blind on that flank. In the carrier bay, Kerr's hands shook until the second shot left, then steadied as training buried the tremor. Keep to escorts, Voss said, voice level. Strip the fence. Leave the towers standing. On the council side, comms stuttered. Oryx's headset crackled with half-words. Hold. Wedge 3. Then a burst of numbers, then silence. Packets fragmenting, he reported. Their backbone saws in and out. Morale channels gone to whispers. Vaynar tried to impose will by rhythm. Reform on the mark, his voice barked across a dozen decks. But deck chiefs shouted local disaster over him. Coolant leaks, broken racks, a gun crew trapped in a jammed cradle. An aide snapped at a runner to fetch a tech who'd skipped meals and fainted on the ladder. On the moon, the second pair of slugs slid home. Dask's jaw worked as he watched the board. We avoid civilian arcs, he said to nobody, to everyone. We keep the rain out of their towns. He touched the etched edge inside the ring, Levin Hale, then gripped the rail. Fire! 2 more streaks crossed the lanes. One struck a frigate's nose and peeled it backward like paper. The other skimmed a cruiser's shield and left sparks trailing as the field collapsed. The cruiser's captain belted himself into a chair that smelled of old coffee and old fear and screamed for screens that wouldn't answer. Pods burst from his hull like dandelion seeds in a gust. Pods in the corridor, Oryx said, marking safe fall. Voss pointed to 2 cutters. Fetch them, he said. Our colors on your flanks. If you take fire, you withdraw, but you go. A carrier near the Terminator line shivered with recoil and then went dark to bleed heat. Kerr leaned back and finally breathed. Pike slapped his shoulder. Count to 10, he said. Then count again. Kerr nodded, eyes rimmed red. In the shelters, the siren dropped to a deeper note while someone's lantern guttered and threw shadows like bent spears across cinder block walls. The father wiped the boy's cheeks with a thumb and whispered, You're doing fine, because saying anything else would have broken him. A warden walked past with a ledger and a pencil worn to a nub, murmuring names to match faces in the half-light. The air smelled of wet coats and soup, and fear kept quiet for the sake of children. Third wave, Oryx called. Window narrow. Voss gave the nod. Stealth hulls spat one more set, surgical and short. Escorts vanished from plots. A capital tried to turn its wounded side away and scraped hull against hull with a neighbor, both grinding sparks as crews swore and shoved. Command messages devolved into clipped fragments. Hold on 4. Who is firing from? Then dead channels. Signal on outer ring, Oryx said, suddenly soft. White flag code, Corvette class. He paused, swallowed. Same phrasing as Part 9's surrender. Standing down, hatches open, crew requests boarding. Mark the vector, Voss replied. Cutters 2 and 3, secure, weapons slung, medics forward. No triumph, only aid. Boarding lights speared through drifting grit. The Corvette lay crooked, lights dim, air venting in soft puffs from a seam. The boarding team crossed with palms visible. Inside, the air tasted of copper and stale tea. A petty officer held a strip of cloth to a crewman's forehead. The boarders handed over real bandages, then an ampule that took the man's pain with a sigh. A medic pressed water pouches into dry hands until his own fingers ached from squeezes. Ing valves. Back at the mountain, the operations room shook as if the rock had a heartbeat. Dask's crew whooped once, then cut themselves off as casualty lists began to crawl up the side display. Strike teams 4 wounded, 1 critical, an adjutant read, voice catching. Shelter 2, 1 child lost to an asthma attack mid-blackout. Resuscitation failed. The cheer that had started up in the cavern guttered like a candle in a draft. Voss stepped into the quiet. Read them all, he said. Names rolled, some from ships, some from streets, some from the lunar gallery where a tech had slipped and broken a wrist. The list ended with a line that punched through him. Convoy guard Oren Voss. Injury, shrapnel lacerations, stable. His cousin. He closed his eyes for an instant, then opened them and nodded to the adjutant to continue with the minor entries, because a sprain could end a life if ignored tomorrow. Oryx tugged his headset aside. Enemy capitals holding, he reported. Screens in tatters, guns slaved to local control, command net limping. They can punish towns if they fire now, but every shot opens a lane for us to answer, and they know it. Keep pods safe, Voss said. Escort anything that powers down to the corridor. Anyone who surrenders gets water and a bandage first. Commanders last. Pike returned from the cutter bay with blood on his sleeves, some theirs, some not. The surrendered corvette had kids aboard, he said, jaw tight, barely shaving. They asked if they could send letters. I told them we'd carry them through if their officers signed the papers. Good, Voss answered. Make space. On the moon, the barrel sighed as it cooled. Vapor curled along the rails. Dask leaned both hands on the console and let his shoulders sag. A tech brought him a cup that tasted like hot tin and bitter grain. He drank and almost gagged, then laughed once without humor. We built this to stall. Be a rain of fire, he said, voice raw. Today it worked. Tomorrow we pay for it with repairs, the tech replied, staring at the etched name. And maybe with more than repairs. Then we repair, Dask said, rubbing his thumb over Levin Hale until skin burned. In the wedge spearhead, a captain slumped in his chair and rubbed grit from his eyes. His aide whispered, Sir, orders? The captain looked at the blank squares where escorts had been and thought of a mess hall with bowls that grew lighter each day. He sent a single line into the net. Stand by, refit screens, hold fire on civilian coordinates unless fired upon. It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't vengeance either. Auric translated the pause for the cavern. Their trigger fingers went stiff, he said. We gave them choice, and some took it. Voss rested a hand on the memorial box. He could feel the grain through his glove as if touch could carry him backward to the plank where Levin's name lived, and the school gym where a boy clutched a tin cup. He looked around the room, miners with cracked knuckles, pilots with red eyes, medics scrubbing hands that smelled of iodine and skin. Report to districts, he said. Open doors slowly. Wardens release in rows. Keep heads low until we confirm the wedges are truly turning away. He turned back to the main board. The ring around Earth looked ragged now, gaps torn where screens had stood. It hadn't broken. Not yet. But the circle knew it could break, and that knowledge traveled faster than any slug. In the shelters, the siren fell to a steady tone. Men lifted blankets from children and gathered bags with stiff fingers. Someone peeled a tin of peaches and offered slices to strangers. The first cheers rolled up from the lower tunnels when the all-clear signal flickered across the heads-up display by the door. Those cheers faltered as the casualty tally reached kitchens and bar. People put bowls down, gripped benches, and listened while names were read over speakers with frayed cords. Some cried. Some stared at their hands. Some stood and walked to duty because stew had to be ladled and train cars had to be pushed and shells had to be cleaned. Voss waited until the last line finished. He cleared his throat and felt how dry it was. Write to every family, he said. Deliver in person if you can walk there. If you can't, find a man who can and send him. He pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at the map one more time. We broke their circle enough to breathe, he said, not loud, not soft. We keep breathing. We keep carrying. Begin the hijack, Voss said, and the operations cavern tightened like a fist. Auric slid the courier core into the cradle he'd rebuilt from scrap, fingers steady despite the tremor in his shoulders. The unit clicked home. A thin line of green lit the edge and threw a knife-bright stripe across his cheek. Legacy layer only, Auric warned. We touch command net and they'll slam the door. He glanced at the laser plasma display, where loops of fleet traffic pulsed in a stumbling rhythm. Their backbone still limps. We walk in through the part they forgot to lock. Pike stood to one side with a headset cupped over one ear, listening to static that tasted like dust on the tongue. Once you're in, make it plain, he said. Verifiable data, nothing staged. If they smell theater, they'll dig in. Voss leaned on the table until his palms felt the grain. Show them what our people carry. Show them what their own officers keep to themselves. Auric breathed through his nose and keyed the send. On blockade bridges and wardrooms, screens flickered. A captain's map glitched and then split to reveal two panes. Left, a feed from a school gym where a line of families waited with bowls while wardens called names. Steam rolled from pots, voices rose and fell. A medic crouched to wrap a girl's wrist in clean bandage tape. Right, a tidy banquet on a council station beyond the writ. Silverware, wine, uniformed servers. A timestamp crawled along both. He did not speak over it. He let the clips run, then swapped them for telemetry, the strike paths from Moon and Mars overlaid with the exact moments wedges had closed their own lanes, the corridors Earth had left open for pods, the cutters that had peeled toward surrender beacons under escort. He added coordinates for live corridors, clear boxes in space, marked with time windows and the conditions for safe passage. Add the medical streams, Voss said. Auric layered in a channel from the cutter bay. Stretchers, gloved hands, iodine on gauze. A medic pressed water pouches into cracked mouths until his fingers shook. A petty officer from the surrendered corvette said, "Thank you," without looking up from a friend's face. On the enemy side, the replies started like hiccups. "Who sent this?" one officer barked. "Kill the feed," another snapped. A younger voice, rough with fatigue, whispered, "It's real. Look at the clocks." Admiral Vaynar's order cut in a breath later. "Firewall this garbage. Wedge leaders to local control. Maintain discipline." Papers shuffled near his mic. Someone coughed. Auric lifted a palm and turned the volume of his own channel down so the room could hear him as well. "Firewall up on 3 ships," he said. "Failing on 2. Crewmen are relaying the clips by hand." He threw another page onto the feed. A calendar of ration cuts scraped straight from wardroom minutes, red lines marching across dates. "They'll start reading aloud in mess halls." "Open my line," Voss said. Auric hesitated for half a heartbeat, then nodded and patched a narrow beam into the legacy layer. "You're live to anyone who hasn't tightened the clamps," he said. "And some who have." Voss didn't clear his throat. He let the roughness stand. "This is Commander Darren Voss of Earth," he said, plain and even. "You hear stories about us. I'm not here to trade myths. I'm addressing men who carry the weight of orders I know too well. Here is what we offer. Power down weapons, open hatches, send a white code on the legacy layer. We will escort you to a corridor that won't kill your crews. Medics will treat your wounded before we speak to your officers. If you return home, you return with proof that you chose life over a policy that starves both sides. If you stay, we will find bunks and bread." He paused, listening to nothing and to everything. "We will not shoot into surrender lanes. We will not mock you. We will write your names correctly." Silence held for 3 breaths. Then the legacy layer sang with low voices, wardroom whispers, engine room mutters, a galley clatter. Pike pulled the headset away and closed his eyes as if that would help him hear more. Auric's pencil ticked against the table in a slow beat. Vaynar came back hard. "All ships, disregard pirate broadcast. Failure to engage is dereliction. Firing drills resume on the count." His words scraped like grit. Even he sounded tired of saying them. A lieutenant on a picket asked, too loud, "With what fuel, sir?" Another voice cursed him off mic. Someone laughed once, short, then bit it back. Auric stabbed a finger at the board. "Outer wedge 4, Corvette code in the box," he said. "They're sending the phrase from Part 9. Cutters 2 and 3, Voss ordered. "Go. Keep your banners bright, medics first. Keep your palms visible." He turned to Auric. "Keep the feed open. Let them watch what we do." The boarding lights speared the dark. On the Corvette's lock, a junior officer stood with his helmet under one arm, face red-eyed and shaved in a hurry. He stared through the window at the cutter crew and he'd raised his hand in an uncertain salute. The boarders returned it, crisp, then cycled the door. Air spilled into the crossway with a bite of cold tea and sweat. The young man swallowed and whispered, "Permission to surrender my ship and ask medical aid for my chief." "Granted," the boarding leader said. "Point me to him." Back in the cavern, Auric folded more proof into the channel. The signed coded surrender from that hull, the medical log entries, the escort plot that would shepherd them to the corridor. He added the line from Voss's earlier policy, commanders last, and highlighted the timestamps where medics had treated enlisted men first. They need to see the order we promised is the order we live, Auric said. More codes blinked on the board. An outer picket carried a single line, standing by for corridor assignment. Another posted the names of crew with chronic conditions and asked for oxygen tanks along the exit path. A third jammed a single word into the layer before its firewall snapped shut. Please. Pike exhaled through his teeth. We are pulling threads, he murmured. Slow. Enough. The battle group's core held for a time. Capitals swung their wounded sides away and tried to reknit their fences with what remained. Vanar snarled for grit and got it from a few hard decks. 2 destroyers edged toward the decoy emitters Voss had lit earlier and spat warning fire that hit nothing. Their crews ate in shifts that left bowls barely dusted. Their gunners held grips with raw palms. They kept moving because that's what men do when motion is the only thing between them and a thought. Another corridor request, Auric said, voice tight now. 3 hulls linked by tow lines. They want to come as a train. Escort them, Voss said. Assign Pike's cutters to the head and tail. Any ship that sideswipes the lane gets a narrow beam warning and a recorded mark. If they still nose in, we shift the convoy aside and let them shame themselves on tape. Pike keyed the cutter net. Head on a swivel, he told his crews. We're shepherds in a field full of broken fences. The convoy slid into the box. Sailors stood at their rails and stared at the earth they had ringed for 10 years. A young officer on the lead tow kept his hand at his brow the entire transit, eyes shining. At the halfway point, he drew a breath that fogged his visor and lowered the salute. He turned his palm outward instead. The cutter pilot met the gesture and pressed his own palm to the glass. In the mountain, men crowded behind Auric and stared at the live feed of that simple exchange. Someone wiped his eyes on a sleeve and pretended he hadn't. Dask leaned a shoulder to the wall and pressed his knuckles against the etched plate of Levin's name, as if the metal could carry warmth backward. Auric checked the clock and the routes he had overlaid. We're past the first window, he said. Second lane opens in 9 minutes, then the third. After that, they'll get smart. He added quieter. They always do. Then we make the most of breathing room, Voss replied. He opened his channel again. To any captain who can hear me, he said, your choice today will outlive any order. If you cannot disobey, then at least aim away from towns and call for medics when your wounded choke. If you can step out now. A long pause answered him. Then a gruff voice, older, came back. We are too proud to surrender. A heartbeat later, the same voice added, softer, we are not proud enough to butcher children. Send your corridor. Auric's hand shook as he tagged their route. Coming through, he said, and sent the escort plots with a timestamp that could be checked by any court later. More ships powered down. A few tried to bluff and were caught by the math. They dropped the act quickly when escort cutters held station and simply waited. Vanar's edicts turned terse, and sparse. Councillor Dorn's propaganda relay burned hot for 5 minutes with a montage of council flags and then went dark as someone cut power in his office to conserve. The legacy layer, the thing no one had loved enough to secure, carried what mattered. By the time the third lane closed, the board in the cavern showed gaps like missing teeth. The blockade still circled Earth, but its bite had slackened. In shelters, wardens lifted doors and let in air that smelled of rain and dust. Cooks stirred pots. Children blinked at lanterns that seemed brighter than an hour ago. Auric sank onto a crate and rubbed his eyes until the world went red, then clear. First wave tallied, he said. We escorted more than I thought possible. He swallowed, then added, we also lost a cutter pilot, hit by debris on the return. Name follows. He handed Voss a slip of paper printed on a grimy strip. Voss read the name and the stone inside his chest shifted. He set the slip on the memorial box and tapped it once. We will write to his father, he said, and to the mother of the boy from the Corvette who lived because our medic was there. Both letters go out together. Pike stared at the board one last time before heading for the bay. "You spoke like a man who's dug graves," he told Voss. "I have," Voss said. "I'd like fewer tomorrow." They sat with that for a breath. Then Oryx stood again because the second window was opening and the math didn't care how tired his hands felt. He keyed the core, checked the time, and raised the channel with a steadiness he had taught himself across 10 years of siege. "Open corridor 2, he said. "Let them through." "Put Vaynar on the line," Voss said, standing straight while the recorder light on the laser plasma panel burned red against the stone. Oryx routed the call through the legacy layer and 2 backup paths. The room's air tasted of coffee that had been, and reheated one time too many. Pike leaned with both fists on the table, watching timer digits march. A sharp click, then a crisply measured voice. "Admiral Vaynar accepting." Background sounds bled through, boots crossing a deck, fabric rasping against a chair, a pen tapping wood. "This channel is recorded," Voss said. "For both parties." "It should be," Vaynar replied. "History turns on whether men keep their word." Voss didn't waste a breath. "Your screen has holes, your crews are thin, and your stores thinner. We can keep carving until there's nothing left but wrecks and grief, or we can end this without another name added to anyone's wall. I am offering timed withdrawal corridors, with escort. You power down weapons, hold course and speed, and I will publish your compliance as it happens." Silence hung for a beat. A second voice, clipped and eager, cut in from Vaynar's side. "Counselor Dorn, oversight. The Council does not negotiate with lawbreakers. The Council should speak to the families you sent to our orbit with empty galleys," Voss said. "Admiral, this offer is to you, commander to commander. 1-hour windows, staggered lanes, recorded clean. If a captain deviates toward a town, he will be filmed doing so." Vaynar exhaled near his microphone, the sound of a man deciding which loss he could live with. "Terms. 3 corridors," Voss said, tapping the map so the red arcs flared. "North band, equatorial band, and far side band. Windows of 20 minutes, set 3 hours apart. Mine clear overlays included. Every charge and hazard we laid in the last decade, mapped and time-stamped. You file routes aboard each ship. We escort with cutters along your edges and publish the tracks in real time." "You expect me to believe you give me your own mine charts?" Dorn snapped. "Lies wrapped as mercy." "We're done killing sailors by accident," Voss said. "If this ends, it ends clean." He didn't add how many of those charges had already been disarmed to feed other projects, or, slid a drive across the table. Pike snapped the latch and held it under the recorder lamp for the camera to see the markings and date. Vaynar's tone lost some enamel. "What do we broadcast to our people?" "The truth," Voss answered. "Your ships leave under terms agreed by both sides and logged. Your wounded are carried first. Any captain who wants medical supplies before jump will get them under escort." A muted argument flared on the other end, Dorn's voice hard, someone else cautioning that reinforcements were months distant and votes volatile at home. Oryx pulled the headset away, eyebrows rising. "Their bleeding political will," he whispered. News feeds full of dock workers striking and station crews banging on mess tables. Vaynar came back alone. "We accept Corridor 1 as proof of good faith," he said. "Far side band. We will not break formation without your cutters bracketing the line." "You'll have them," Voss said. "Publishing schedules now." Oryx's fingers flew. The corridor chart flickered into public channels, watermarks stamped with the Council crest and Earth's seal side by side. "Admiral," Voss added, "this ends when you leave without taking a last swing at the people who can't swing back." "I understand," Vaynar said, each syllable careful. "See you at the edge." The call died. The red light on the recorder went dark. Pike blew air through his teeth and straightened. "Shepard's again." "Get the banners bright," Voss said. "Make the lanes clear enough for a blind man to walk. Cameras on every flank." The first withdrawal wave formed while Earth's morning crept across cloud banks. Heads-up displays in the cutter bay glowed with 3 rectangles, each with a clock counting down. Crews tugged gloves until seams bit knuckles. Medics strapped panniers stuffed with bandages and pressurized water pouches to their chests. Kerr stood on the deck with his helmet sewed in his elbow, staring at the far side box and rubbing a thumb over a scuff he refused to polish out. Pike clapped his shoulder once, a short, solid strike that stung in a good way. "Go," Voss said. Cutters rose from their cradles and slid into positions along the corridor edges. Their running lights blinked in a pattern Auric had broadcast as the visual code for safe passage. 3 slow, 2 quick, 1 long. Across from them, the first column of blockade hulls edged forward. They looked larger when they weren't hunting. Ships that had carried cold watch for a decade moved like tired cattle toward a gate. On the council flagship, Vaynar stepped to the rail and watched his crews work. The bridge smelled of printer ink and old coffee. An aide placed a paper copy of the corridor map at his elbow, a ritual to anchor the moment in something you could hold. "Signal Earth cutters," Vaynar said. "We are entering at their mark." On the cutter bridge, the pilot answered with a gesture the cameras would see. Palm up, then 2 fingers pointing to the lane. The convoy angled into the box, engines trimmed to a steady push. A single tug towed a crippled frigate whose hull still showed a scar from the lunar gun's second salvo. As the train aligned, Dorn's voice smeared across an open band. "Reinforcements will restore order. Delay this spectacle." A crackling reply from a distant committee. "Replens are 3 months out. Public sentiment hostile. Authorizations withheld. Complete the departure." Inside the mountain, crews crowded around the display. Dask stood with arms crossed tight across his chest, jaw hard. He didn't speak, but his fingers traced the outline of a name etched on a memory plate secured next to the console. Auric narrated softly for the record. "Wave 1 entering lane. Power signatures within tolerance. No weapons warm. Bracket cutters filming from both sides." He glanced at Voss. "Every step we promised, we're showing." Midway through, a destroyer drifted to starboard, flirting with the lane's edge. Cutter 2 slewed closer, lights flashing the sign, "Null for correction." Voss watched the screen like a man watching a glass set near an elbow at a crowded table. The destroyer's bow dipped back into line. Cutter 2 logged the wobble and stamped the time. Auric pinned the clip into the public feed with a caption, "Minor drift, corrected, no shots fired." Pike exhaled. "They're tired," he said. "Everyone tries to walk straight after a day that broke their knees." The head of the column touched the jump limit. Engines kindled in cones that painted thin ovals across the cutter's hulls. One by one, the blockade ships vanished with neat flashes, leaving afterglow that hung like smoke. Men in the mountain breathed as if each blink took a weight from their lungs. Kerr watched through the canopy and realized his fists were clenched so tight his fingernails hurt when he pried them loose. Wave 2 followed at the equatorial band. A medical tender requested a halt to move a stretcher. Auric approved and pinned the stop to the log with a signature. Pike's cutters delivered a crate of oxygen to a corvette with a dying scrubber fan. The crew on that ship lined the rail and saluted without words. Cameras caught faces streaked with grime and salt. The feed went out live. Dorn tried one last time to reframe the scene. "These images are for our records, not for public consumption," he declared into the void. Voss answered with a clip of his own, only the map, the timestamps, and the shared watermark. "Everything is for the record," he said, not bothering to hide his voice. By the third window, even the hard wedges had accepted departure as the only door left. The bridge noise over Vaynar's channel sounded different, chairs sliding softly, not slammed, sailors speaking to each other as men do when an ending is near, but not shameful. "Thank you for the lanes," a junior officer said into an open mic before someone clicked it off. Voss didn't ask. Auric to delete it. When the final column formed at the north band, the mountain felt warmer. Cooks rolled out trays heavy with stew. A boy in a patched jacket carried a basket of hard rolls down the corridor and handed them to watchstanders along the railing. The bread smelled like yeast and hearth. Someone laughed, quick and startled, when a roll bounced off a boot and skittered away. Last group entering, Auric reported. Publishing compliance packet to both archives with hash. Let them go, Voss said quietly. Far above, the last ships crossed the line and winked out. Silence followed, wide and unthreatening. Earth's night looked like itself again, without a necklace of daggers. In the bay, crews didn't cheer, not at first. Men stood with hands on rails, staring at the emptiness where enemies had stood, and felt a throb in their throats that had nothing to do with victory parades. Pike wiped a palm over his face and found grit. Not prey, he said. Witnesses. Both, Voss answered. And neither. They're men who made a choice today. He walked to the memorial box and set a new envelope on the stack, one addressed to the parents of the cutter pilot lost in the earlier corridor, one addressed to a council petty officer whose name he had copied from a surrender manifest, asking whether his mother needed medicine. He pressed the envelopes flat and felt the papers drag under his fingertips. Outside, on a ridge above the cavern, Dask stood with his helmet tucked under his arm. Wind carried dust that scratched his cheeks. He looked up at a sky that finally seemed like a sky again, and thought of plates welded in dark tunnels and a young man who had sealed a leak with his body. He raised 2 fingers to his brow and let his hand fall. Back at the console, Auric shut down the recorder. The laser plasma panel cooled, glow fading to a dull smear. Logs synced, proof scattered to a dozen caches. The would be speeches later and arguments in halls far away, but the tape would outlive them all. Voss faced the crew. We will publish a single sentence, he said. The blockade withdrew along lanes agreed by both sides, under escort, with casualties minimized and names kept. Then we start rebuilding. Faces lifted, some eyes shone, some looked hollow and relieved at once. Boots scuffed stone as men turned toward tasks that could be measured, moving crates, fixing lifts, writing letters. The work sounded like life. Lock the books, publish the doctrine, Voss said, voice carrying across the planning hall that once served as a bunker. Tables were scarred from years of elbows and spilled coffee. Chalk dust hung in the air, glowing in slants of morning light that fell through narrow windows. Runners moved with armfuls of folders, stamps thudded, pens scratched. The words siege doctrine appeared on the front page. Stealth industry, logistics warfare, timed deception, and a standing order that humanitarian conduct is operational power, not charity. Auric set a binder in front of him. I've cross-checked language with every unit that lived it, he said. No theatrics, just what worked. He tapped a paragraph that outlawed gloating and codified surrender lanes. If a future officer forgets why this matters, the examples are here. Dates, places, who opened which hatch. Pike leaned on his forearms, knuckles scuffed, eyes ringed with sleeplessness that he didn't apologize for. My corps reads this as law, he said. Patrol craft wear bright markings. We board with palms visible. We chase pirates and slavers, not enemies who already threw down weapons. Any raider who crosses that line loses his ship and his badge. Dask arrived late, boots dusted in lunar grit, coat smelling of cold metal and old oil. He dropped blueprints on the table and spoke without preamble. The barrels come hair triggers, he said. We keep rails warm enough for drills, not strikes. Add dump wells and starward shutters. If a foreign fleet prowls our skies again, the mouths open only on a vote. Until then, they track debris and deflect rocks. We built those guns to stop a rain of fire. From today, they defend traffic lanes and miners. Voss thumbed the page edges and nodded. Make it public. By afternoon, the notice ran everywhere. Printed sheets pasted to doors, classroom walls, station corridors, the entryway of the tribunal hall repurposed as a registry office. Teachers used the case studies as arithmetic problems. Dock bosses kept copies next to cargo ledgers. Wardens filed the drills with evacuation charts. A city that had learned to move in tunnels now learned to move in daylight. The council tried to salvage pride. A communiqué drifted in over a diplomatic band, couched in careful phrases about strategic redeployment and review of supply policies. It avoided the word withdrawal. It pretended the corridors had always been theirs. Dorn's signature sat at the bottom. Vaynar's name did not. Voss issued exactly one reply. "Receipt acknowledged," he said into the recorder. "Earth confirms cessation of blockade. We file our records with open timestamps and signed terms." He did not add a speech. The tape spoke for itself. That evening brought a crackle of unwelcome noise. Auric lifted a handset and listened with a frown. "There's shouting in council dockside assemblies," he said. "Workers pounding on tables with spoons. Families of sailors asking where the food went. A rumor about a no-confidence vote." He set the handset down gently. "They're bleeding at home." "Then we do not gloat," Voss answered. "We fix our own house." Fixing it began before dawn. Crews rolled drums of sealant into cracked neighborhoods. A line of volunteers carried bricks in a past-hand rhythm that whispered down alleys like a soft drum line. Welders patched tram rails with sparks that spattered boots. Bakers lifted trays that smelled of yeast and toasted crust. Children ran errands with baskets clutched in skinny arms. In the shipyards, workers peeled armor off raiders and refitted bays for ferries. A medic who had spent months in a cutter treated a mason's ankle and laughed when the man thanked him like a wounded officer. The heads-up display on the wall near the planning table showed a list that mattered more than any casualty roll. Schools reopening, water pressure stable in 12 districts, fresh vegetables arriving by convoy from hothouses buried in mountain soil. Voss circled each line with a felt pen until the ink bled. On the moon, Dask walked the gallery where a name was cut into the first ring. He slid gloved fingers across the letters and then set a new plate 2 meters to the right. "This one lists the crews who tightened bolts in winter," he told a young tech who would inherit his post. "You'll add more names, people who make things hold. A city thanks soldiers at parades. It forgets machinists until the day a hinge fails. Don't let it forget." "I won't," the tech said, voice thin behind a visor as frost traced the rail and crunched under boots. Auric stood in a lecture room 2 levels above the old command cavern. He faced a row of cadets with short hair, clean collar seams, and notebooks that still creaked when opened. He wrote signal grammar on a board and underlined it. "You learn how an enemy breathes," he said. "You learn where he eats and why he lies. You never broadcast what you can prove false. If you ever speak in the name of Earth, you speak straight." He played a recording of the corridor salutes. The room went quiet in a way he recognized. Not awe, not fear, recognition. Pike met his new captains in a yard that smelled of diesel and hot steel. He walked the line, tapped hulls with his knuckles, and pointed with his chin. "You will be tempted to swagger," he said. "Save it. Men on these decks have hauled bandages into enemy ships and carried water for sailors who tried to kill them a week earlier. That is the bar you walk under." He held up a badge stamped with a shield and an open hand. "You wear this only if you can hold a lane without firing a shot." Near sunset, a courier arrived with a narrow envelope, hand-delivered across borders by a civilian freighter that risked the trip for a bag of coffee and a letter home. Inside lay a single page. The handwriting slanted forward, quick and spare. "Commander Voss," it read. "I will not apologize for the orders I carried. I also will not pretend I don't know what they cost. You kept your promises. You escorted men who had nothing left but breath. I recommend to my superiors that this affair remain ended. Vaynar." There was no seal. Voss folded the page and slid it under the blotter, where it would live among other necessary truths. Night brought the ceremony he had put off for as long as duty would allow. The memorial wall sat 3 corridors from the main hall, quiet and clean. Candles licked at wicks in little pools of wax. Names marched in rows cut into wood darkened by the oils of thousands of hands. Families stood with coats pulled tight, heads bare. Some brought flowers, some brought tools. A miner placed a hammer at the base and stepped back with eyes wet as if wind had found them. Voss reached into his pocket and withdrew a square of fabric faded by years of thumb and time, Kalen's unit patch. A boy in a patched jacket stood near his knee, the same boy who had found that patch in rubble and kept it like a treasure until Voss asked for one last loan. The boy nodded without being asked, as if he understood what was coming and why it had to. Voss pressed the cloth under a small plate that read Kalen Voss, tucking it where it would never blow away. His thumb lingered on the stitchwork. He drew breath through a throat that didn't want to let air pass and spoke without turning to face the gathering. "They tried to cage us," he said. "They taught us timing." The words were not a shout. They didn't need to be. They traveled down the corridor and settled on shoulders like a cloak that warmed without weight. A bell rang once. Families stepped forward in twos and threes, laying rings, coins, hand-drawn pictures, a worn bootlace, a folded letter smoothed so many times the fibers had turned silky. Voss stood back and let them have the moment. When the last offering was set down, he raised his hand, palm outward, and every man in the room answered the gesture with the same quiet salute given to the young officer in the corridor during the withdrawal. It felt correct, and it felt final. Work did not stop for grief. The next day, crews with chipped nails and bruised shins loaded crates onto trucks while children chased one another between axles and shouted promises about growing up to fly cutters or teach codes. A stonemason wedged a final block into a broken arch while a baker across the street slid loaves from an oven and banged pans to call neighbors. A tram took its first passengers across a bridge that had sagged for years. The wheels rattled, a woman laughed, and a man at the back wiped his eyes and blamed the dust. Oryx Academy enrolled its first class. Dask's crews posted the new rules for the guns on the gallery door. Pike's captains ran patrol drills with relief workers aboard so that muscle memory and kindness learned to share the same deck. The registry office stamped permits for traders who had waited a decade to move cargo without paying fear as tax. One final transmission arrived from Council Space, a public statement with careful phrasing about learning outcomes and restored balance. It landed with a dull thud. The men who had eaten thin soup aboard blockade ships watched it in their messes and shrugged. Dock workers went back to loading ships. Mothers folded laundry. The story had moved on. Voss walked the ridge above the cavern where the first carriers had hidden. Wind carried dust that tasted like dry earth and old stone, not ash. Stars pricked the sky as if they had been washed. He could hear the city below, hammers, distant music, a dog barking at a cart. He stood there until the cold gnawed through his coat, and then he went back inside to sign another stack of papers, because endings still need signatures. At his desk, he wrote 2 letters. The first went to the parents of the cutter pilot who had died escorting a surrender lane. He told them exactly what their son had done, how his hands had held steady while another crew survived to write home. The second went to the mother of a petty officer from the corvette that had powered down. He enclosed a list of medicines sent with her boy's convoy and the names of medics who had promised to check on him during the jump. He affixed stamps, breathed on the glue until it set, and stacked the envelopes for morning post. When he finally stood, the room creaked like an old ship easing in a berth. He looked once more at the map pinned with routes that now carried trade instead of raids, and at the notice board where someone had written school enrollment deadline Friday in a hand that spilled beyond the margins. He smiled, weary and real, and turned off the lamp. The council blockade had lasted 10 years and ended in 3 corridors marked by patience, proof, and rules kept in daylight. Earth did not conquer a rival empire. Earth made an empire choose to leave. That choice echoed outward, in dockside votes far away, in cadet classrooms here, in a new treaty clause drafted by men who remembered hunger and swore never to turn it into a weapon again. The ring that once tightened became a lesson hammered into law. At the memorial wall, the candles guttered and then steadied. The patch stayed tucked where it belonged. Outs. ID. The night wind carried the scent of bread and cold water. Men slept. Children dreamed with full bellies. Guns under rock watched the sky without anger. The siege was over, and the future, at last, belonged to hands that could build. If this tale sparked something in you, hit subscribe for more hard-edged HFY sagas delivered straight to you. Now it's your move. With the enemy's cipher cracked in your hands, how do you play it? Shield Earth, seed disinformation, or pull the pins on their empire? Tell us what you'd do and why in the comments. We read them all. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where survival turns into strategy and strategy into legend. See you in the next story.